Hello and welcome. Thank you for coming along this evening. This evening we're going to look at China and the new scramble for Africa. There is a scramble underway, and we've talked about this before because this is not the first time there's been a scramble for Africa. This time it seems to be announced as a window of opportunity for Africa, largely initiated from regions in the north. But as we pointed out in previous programs, this is far from the first scramble for Africa. And the question is, can we learn from what happened in the previous scrambles for Africa about what is likely to unfold for both the populations in Africa and for the world in general? As previous commentators have put it, and we've covered it in previous programs, there is a window of opportunity in Africa, especially in the north. Though Europe remains Africa's largest trading partner, Russian, Chinese, Turkish, and Arab Gulf patrons are filling the geopolitical vacuum. Unquote. What's interesting to us here is the Chinese are being regarded, nowhere are they on the map here, but they're being regarded as a patron for this new scramble for Africa. What's behind this? And what's meant by filling the geopolitical vacuum? There's no geopolitical vacuum in Africa. There are countries with leaders and people. This isn't a vacuum. What's meant by a geopolitical vacuum? All of these things should be investigated at length.
Demographics is destiny. Within 4 years, Africa will have over 100 cities with more than a million inhabitants. By mid-century, the continent's total population will eclipse 2.4 billion. Africa will steadily displace the economies of East Asia as the leading destination for offshore manufacturing. Production and consumption will grow, while new value chains will be created in the process. Even now, foreign investors are constructing ports, railways, and highways across the continent. As a result, 3 new trans-Mediterranean corridors are emerging that will glue Europe and Africa. However, the configurations will have to traverse North Africa's gatekeepers, giving Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt the leverage to dictate terms.
The scramble is underway, but we're going to be looking at this Chinese aspect of it in particular today. China and the new scramble for Africa has a lot in common with a recent scramble in the 19th century for Africa. At that time, there was a movement onto the continent in a very strategic manner to conquer territory and declare possession on the part of certain European countries, like France, for example, under the Commandant Marchand. We should recall the dimensions of the 19th century scramble and how it came about and why it was called a scramble. Well, it was a scramble largely because people on the ground teamed up with diplomats in Europe to declare ownership over territory on a continent that no one had yet explored. And in a conference that took place between November 1884 and February 1885, European powers met in Berlin to agree upon the rules for occupying territory and declaring ownership or control over that territory in a continent, as I say, they had not yet penetrated. What's interesting is that there is now the question about the new scramble for Africa, particularly in reference to what's new about it. Well, we say the same European leaders largely gathering in the G7 just in June of this year, 2021, gathered in Cornwall in England for a conference of the G7, and they appear to be squabbling over China. Not Africa, but over China. But, as we'll see, it's more complicated than that, because they're squabbling over what China may be doing in the world at large, including in Africa. What do we want to learn about that? Well, we need to learn something about China's Great Belt and Road Plan, as it's been called. One belt, one road, linking large parts of the world that used to be linked through the Silk Road to China in the past. We're also going to look at what the Chinese understood to be empires of the weak. As you can see in this painting, Chinese painting of a European ship trading in Asia, the Chinese made a very careful study of how Europeans emerged as colonial powers. And they're applying some of what they learned to what their strategy is going to be in places like Africa and elsewhere. First, we should recall some important features of the 19th century scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference took place, as we stated, among European powers, with no Africans present at all. In fact, the whole thought of Africans having any idea or control over their own destinies was laughable to those people gathered around these European conference tables. The only real question for them was which European power would come to dominate which portion of Africa that they drew on maps. Basil Davidson, a historian of Africa, has looked into this in some detail, and it's worth following his narrative. He developed it in a film from 1984 called Africa. Over 35 years ago, it was written and presented in this film, and it's worth paying attention to what he called the magnificent African cake, as he was quoting the King of Belgium at the time, King Leopold, who said he wanted his share of the magnificent African cake. Let's take a look at what went on, according to Basil Davidson.
Old trading posts like this one had long been the scene of a partnership between maritime traders from Europe and local Africans. By the 1880s, that old partnership was being swept away in a dramatic change, the outcome of a new European drive for overseas empire. Industrialized countries led by France and Britain had begun to invade the Black Continent, each hoping for new sources of raw materials for its factories, new markets for its manufacturers, and new positions of advantage against its rivals.
This was called the Scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed. Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful. but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a Congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants.
Well, China and the new scramble for Africa. What's new about this? Well, what's new is that although the same European powers, essentially, are gathered around a table, not in Africa, they're starting to refer to Africa on maps, much like they did in the 19th century. But the new non-present participant in this is China itself, that has its own designs for developing its maps in relation to Africa and mapping out new trade and financial relations with the entire continent. Let's try to learn something about China's Great Belt and Road Plan, as it's been referred to. What is it? Well, it's often referred to as the B&R or BR&I plan, that is the Belt and Road Initiative. And Jin and Lee informs us from CNBC what it's all about, where it came from, why it's been silent for a while, but has emerged since 2013 as a major strategy of the Chinese leadership. Let's take a look.
You might find this hard to imagine, but for years, China firmly believed it had to keep a low profile in international matters. In former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping's words, it was important to hide your strengths and bide your time. That's why the Belt and Road Initiative marks a huge change in China's foreign policy. And it's not just a small shift. It's a plan that will have serious implications for how the world develops. Called 一带一路 in Chinese, the Belt and Road Initiative was first announced by Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2013. It's a globe-spanning plan with the purpose of strengthening trade, infrastructure, and investment links between China and an estimated 65 other countries. Together, potentially participating countries account for more than 30% of global GDP, 62% of the world's population, and 75% of known energy reserves. Despite what the name may imply, the road actually refers to a maritime network of shipping lanes running from China through Southeast Asia, Africa, and all the way to Europe. The belt, on the other hand, refers to the overland routes stretching from Central Asia to Europe. The most visible part of the Belt and Road so far has been infrastructure. In Kenya, for example, China built a $3.2 billion railway connecting the port city of Mombasa to the country's capital, Nairobi. It now takes just 4.5 hours to get between the two cities, about a third of the time it used to take on the old rail system. But it's not just Kenya. Across the world, the Belt and Road has meant billions of dollars in investment from the Chinese. In Sri Lanka, about $200 million of Chinese funding went into the country's second international airport. After all the investment, though, it's been dubbed the world's emptiest international airport.
From Africa to Asia, there are many infrastructure projects involving railways, roads, and bridges. But that's just one part of China's Belt and Road initiative.
Some say it's also serving as a huge marketing campaign for Chinese money looking for investment. Yet, despite the public nature of the Belt and Road, there is a lot about this huge plan that we don't know about.
The number of countries estimated to be in this initiative is between 60 and 115, while the amount of money committed is said to be between $1 trillion and $8 trillion. And then there's the question of who's coordinating this.
It's definitely backed by President Xi, while China's powerful state planner and DRC was involved in initial policy planning. But in terms of execution, experts believe Chinese state-owned enterprises have the most influence in terms of what the Belt and Road will ultimately look like. What we do know is that the Belt and Road will be made up of several economic corridors. All but one of the corridors connect several countries, like this route which connects China to the Netherlands. It will include projects like this cargo train that carries goods from East China to London in about 2 weeks. But let's take a closer look at the only corridor connected to just one country, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Pakistan is seen as the buckle in the belt. It was reportedly promised more than $60 billion in Chinese investments, although experts think the actual figure is closer to $20 billion. This corridor would link China's far western region of Xinjiang to Pakistan's port city of Gwadar. This is an important trading route for China, particularly because of the country's location between China and its energy suppliers in Africa and the Middle East. You see, China has a huge appetite for energy. It's the world's largest oil importer and is said to be the biggest gas importer too. But Pakistan may have gotten more than what it was expecting when it took China's loans. The country's prime minister, celebrity cricketer Imran Khan, is fighting to keep the economy afloat. And some are worried that Pakistan's debts to China may ultimately hurt those efforts.
But it's not just Pakistan or even China which got more than what it bargained for. There's a lot of talk now on debt trap diplomacy, which involves the Belt and Road.
The Washington-based Center for Global Development raised serious concerns about 8 nations receiving Belt and Road financing. They include Pakistan, the Maldives, Mongolia, and even Djibouti, a country of less than 1 million, where China has its only overseas military base. The think tank said those nations mounting debts to China put their economies at risk of potential widespread defaults. China faced setbacks when some countries' leaders who had signed onto Belt and Road projects did not regain power. One example, Malaysia's new government, which moved to cancel a $20 billion rail project. And there's the Maldives, which opened a bridge with Chinese funds. Now, it wants to renegotiate its debt to China. Even when it looks like China has a winning hand, like when it took control of Sri Lanka's Hambantota port after the country couldn't make repayments, Locals protested what they called a colonial invasion. And then there are the reports about geopolitical ambitions underlying the Belt and Road. Beijing says the Belt and Road is purely a peaceful economic project without geopolitical or military intent. But developments like its military projects with Pakistan have some experts questioning that. They worry Beijing has military intentions for some of the ports at which it has a large presence, like that Sri Lankan port it took over. The Belt and Road provides financing for infrastructure, which a lot of countries are desperate for. But now, as worries mount, we're left to see what's next for China's ambitious program.
Well, we have a right to ask. In fact, we have an obligation to ask what is motivating China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. In part, China's focus on Africa and the BRI stems from, first of all, their own bitter experience of colonial humiliation at the hands of the British and other European Western nations. Most of the nations gathered in Cornwall, England, squabbling with one another about strategy for international economics, had the history of invading China in 1900. In one form or another, either directly or indirectly, most of the G7 nations had invaded China over a century ago. In part as well, China's focus on the BRI stems from a deep and careful historical understanding of how the West came to dominate the world. This wasn't self-evident because China was far more powerful at the beginning of the early modern period, had a bigger navy, had probably circumnavigated the world before Columbus, and had very powerful land ownings as well. First, then, let's explore each of these two issues. First, let's consider China's experience of its own colonial domination, in this case under the British. Hong Kong can be seen from space, and in fact, you can take aerial photos of it and look at it in detail. I'd urge you to do this when you get a chance and zoom in on the area. Learn what you can from the geography. The history of it is far more interesting than most of us realize in the Western world. The British, in effect, had tried to trade with China for years, particularly for tea. They felt the Chinese were controlling the trade too much, and they wanted to induce them to trade more freely with Britain. The Chinese emperor wasn't interested and basically told them to get lost. But that wasn't the end of it. The British began to use military force.
This is Hong Kong. 177 years ago, as the conclusion of the First Opium War, the United Kingdom and China signed a treaty that read, His Majesty the Emperor of China cedes to Her Majesty the Queen of Great Britain, etc., the island of Hong Kong, to be possessed in perpetuity by Her Britannic Majesty, her heirs and successors, and to be governed by such laws and regulations as Her Majesty the Queen of Great Britain, etc., shall see fit to direct. With that, the British Empire got just a little bit bigger. The population of the island in that year was reported as 7,450. Nobody would have imagined what this island, dotted only by a few fishing villages, would become. Fast forward 18 years, another opium war, another treaty. It has now been agreed between the governments of Great Britain and China that the limits of British territory shall be enlarged under lease. Fast forward 38 years, the third and final agreement. It has now been agreed between the governments of Great Britain and China that the limits of British territory shall be enlarged under lease to the extent indicated generally on the annexed map. The term of this lease shall be 99 years. 99 years, as good as forever to the signers of this agreement.
The former British island colony of Hong Kong is so densely packed with banking and trading firms, it's known as the world's most vertical city. The place lives, eats, and breathes money.
The story of how Hong Kong came to be British reflects the empire's often ruthless pursuit of profit. It's an extraordinary story, even if it is one of the most shameful in British history.
And yet this dark episode began innocently enough. It was born from the English passion for a cup of tea.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
How many types of tea do you have?
Mainly it's all the Chinese tea we have.
All
types,
of them?
Yes.
Oh, it smells lovely, doesn't it?
Yes. Would you like to have a cup of tea?
Oh, I'd love to have one, yes.
This way, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In the early 19th century, China was virtually the only place tea was grown. But there was a problem. For 3 centuries, China had severely restricted trade with the West. The British were desperate and even sent a delegation to China. They begged the emperor to open up his country and take some British products in exchange for tea. They presented him with all sorts of trinkets, games and curiosities, scientific instruments and toys. But he remained resolutely unimpressed.
We possess all things, said the emperor. I set no value upon things strange or ingenious, and I have no use for your country's manufactures.
But to get the tea they craved, the British had one thing to trade that many Chinese craved even more: opium. The drug was illegal in China, though the ban was widely ignored. There were an estimated 12 million peasants addicted to opium. The authorities there called it a deadly poison ruining the minds and morals of our people. The British grew opium poppies in India. There they processed it in factories on a colossal scale. Finally, it was shipped to China and sold to smugglers. With the profits, British traders bought Chinese tea. Two men in particular made a handsome profit out of opium. One was William Jardine, the son of a Scottish farmer. The other was his business partner and fellow Scot, James Matheson. From boats moored off the Chinese mainland, they sold industrial quantities of opium to be trafficked into China. At the time, selling opium wasn't illegal in Britain, nor did it cause them any moral qualms.
Jardine himself said that trading in opium was the safest and most gentlemanly speculation I'm aware of, and his partner Matheson thought it no more than morally equivalent to selling brandy or champagne in Britain. Business was just business.
In 1839, the Chinese emperor decided he'd had enough. He ordered more than 1,000 tons of British-supplied opium to be seized and destroyed. The British government was outraged. It invoked a sacred and very convenient principle, the principle of free trade. Britain had to be allowed to trade what and where she liked, especially in the case of opium.
Opium was making Britain rich. It soon accounted for over a fifth of the income of the government of India. Two mighty empires, each convinced of their own superiority, were now set on collision course.
The Opium Wars were about to begin. Britain's first ocean-going iron warship, the Nemesis, built in Liverpool, was sent out to take on the Emperor's navy. It helped destroy much of it in a single afternoon.
This was the modern world confronting an ancient one, sailing junks against steam-driven gunboats. The Chinese had no choice but to surrender and to open 5 ports to British trade. China had been forced to enter the modern global economy.
Hong Kong was one of Britain's prizes from the Opium Wars. Close to the Chinese mainland, it was perfect for trading with the newly opened Chinese Empire. Matheson moved his headquarters to Hong Kong in January 1841. Profits from the opium trade doubled.
So this most bustling of British colonies was built on a drug which stupefies people. Even more remarkably, the British continued to ship opium into China until well into the 20th century.
Hong Kong grew at an astonishing rate. A new bank was founded to service the China trade, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. We know it as HSBC. Today, Hong Kong is a hothouse for global finance. But what about the company that played such a large part in founding Hong Kong's prosperity? Jardine Matheson & Co. Well, they're still here and still doing very well.
These are the modern headquarters of Jardine Matheson. The round windows have earned it the local nickname, the building of 1,000 orifices. At least, that's the polite version. Doubtless, somewhere in the foundations are buried the consciences of its founders.
In 1997, more than a century and a half after the Opium Wars, Hong Kong was returned to China.
The Union flag will now be lowered, and the national flag of the People's Republic of China will be raised.
All the important people in Hong Kong reached the first sight of their new flag.
When the British finally quit Hong Kong in 1997, they did so boasting they were handing on a territory intimately wired into the world economy. The shameful origins of British colonial presence here conveniently forgotten. But China has never entirely forgotten. How a foreign power forced it at gunpoint to allow millions of its citizens to be turned into drug addicts. The spoils of empire made Britannia rich.
Well, the results of that were pretty extraordinary because they came to dominate the entire Asian empires, the British controlled regions, and transform their economies for the benefit of the British industries.
From the colonies came gold and silver and spices, even plants. And so vast was her empire, Britain could choose to grow them where she liked. Tea bushes could be planted for the first time in India and Ceylon. Tobacco planted in southern Africa. And there was a particular seed that made a very rich empire even richer. In the summer of 1877, a large packing case arrived here in Singapore's Botanic Gardens. Inside the case were 22 seedlings of rubber trees collected by British plant hunters in Brazil.
So, asking what is motivating China's Belt and Road Initiative, in part, it's their full understanding of how it was that the Europeans, who they regarded as essentially weak at the time, came to dominate the world. And so they undertook a careful and historically informed understanding of how the West emerged as the dominant power. They looked particularly at the fact that Europeans dominated enclaves more than they did conquer territory. China was a land-based empire. It was interested in protecting the control of land, but hadn't done much to develop its sea connections with the wider world. This is precisely what the Europeans did, initially under the Portuguese, then under the Dutch, then under the French and English, who were rivals for control of enclaves off the coast of Africa, off the coast of South America, throughout all of the islands in the New World, the Caribbean, and in the islands in Southeast and South Asia. But as the Chinese understood and actually wrote accounts of, depicting them with the European flags, the real story of European expansion and the creation of the New World Order had to do with not so much conquest, but domination of strategic points of interest, either in West Africa, South Africa, India, Sri Lanka, several of the islands in Asia, and then the coastal regions in Africa and South America. South America, northern portions, and in the Caribbean. Very few portions of European control occurred before the 20th century in parts of North America, because the American settler colonies had declared an independence against European domination. And they won that independence against the British, in part with the support of the French Empire. A very interesting chapter in the intercolonial rivalry for the domination of foreign enclave economies. The Chinese understood that there were several characteristics to the emerging world system from the time of Columbus onwards. Basically, there were 7 key components. They were made up of maritime trading enclaves, island plantation economies, white settler communities in a few of these areas, but not many. The white settler communities were confined to the Caribbean islands, to the coastal regions of North America. There was not an overwhelming expansion into the continent until the 19th century. Some of the settlements occurred along rivers in West Africa and at the strategic point of trade on the way to India in South Africa. Agriculture was industrialized, or it could be, because the main input to agriculture was human labor, and that was expensive. It was being brought thousands of miles from one continent to another. So anything that could save on the input of human labor and be mechanized was thought to be virtuous and a good idea. And in fact, they invested a lot of effort in industrializing agriculture, mechanizing it in the first instance, and then running that mechanization on various forms of non-human labor, including water power. This occurred particularly in the early 19th century with the emergence of cotton and the domination of cotton plantations from the region that had previously been dominated by sugar and tobacco production. It was all sustained by an asymmetrical trade and flow of capital. Capital came out of Europe and was applied to the acquisition of labor here and the movement of labor across the ocean to build the island plantation economies, and profits were siphoned off back to the investor capital in the European centers. Prior to the 1780s, it all rested on the energy of slaves, an energy which was relatively expensive, the most expensive of the 3 inputs of production. Land was cheap. Capital was easily available. Labor had to be imported thousands of miles, and that was expensive. That's where the big expense came. Now we use oil, and there's a new kind of servitude to oil as the energy source. But prior to that, the energy source for the development of Western empires was slaves. Private capital was invested overseas for raw materials and expanded markets for sales. So if you made money in this exchange, you invested it in more access to raw materials or more markets to sell your industrialized goods to. The expectation grew, and this is what the Chinese understood very well, of continuous growth being created on a worldwide basis of exchange. This is what scholars like Ian Morris at the Oriental Institute outlined very clearly as the source of why the West rules, as he added, for now. If any of these things are interrupted, it's not at all clear that the West will rule for long. So, one of the attributes of the 19th century scramble for Africa was that it expanded from the coastal enclaves into the interior. The anxiety to get hold of particular territories was required by the investors in such things as railroads. If you wanted to create a kind of river of your own, in addition to the natural rivers, which you tried to control, the river of your own was the railroad. And the railroad was expensive. It was a capital investment from which you expected a return. In fact, investors in railroads demanded a return. So European governments became beholden to those who lent money to create the infrastructure for export. And the infrastructure for export was, in the first instance, ports, but more essentially, to get into the continent, the railroads. Now, this the Chinese began to understand with real clarity. And here is why the scramble seems to be underway at this point. At least the outside investors, what are referred to here by the commentator as patrons, are seeing possibilities, and particularly the Chinese, for the expansion through railroads. Now, this is why it's quite interesting to think about the Chinese in reference to Africa. Just in this month, earlier in June of 2021, the Queen, a 95-year-old Queen of England, hosted a reception for world leaders. It's important to keep the people in mind here. The Queen is in Cornwall for the G7 dinner, greeting all the heads of state of the Western Alliance. You'll remember that it's her son, Charles, Prince Charles, the next inheritor of the throne after the 95-year-old Queen dies or abdicates, who will be taking over that empire. And it is he who presided over the transfer of Hong Kong from British colony status to independence in 1997, along with Tony Blair and the officials at the time, Christopher Patten, the governor of Hong Kong. So, in the June meetings, the Belt and Road Initiative is being presented as an alternative to what Biden, President of the United States, suggested. What's being referred to as the B3W, namely Build Back Better. That's his approach to counter China's Great Belt and Road Initiative. Europeans are squabbling amongst themselves as to what that Building Back Better initiative is going to be and how it's going to counteract the Chinese BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Al Jazeera has given some great commentary on this, and you can follow this on Transition Studies. Anything with a yellow border has the story behind it. And you can find out what's behind G7's rival to China's Belt and Road Initiative by looking at their program called Inside Story and a half-an-hour report on the issue. Some of it's going to have to do with response to the global crisis, because we now need, in effect, a global response. China has been among the first nations to develop its own vaccine and export it to countries in Africa. President Biden is urging the nations of the free world, as he calls them, to undertake a similar effort. Will India gain from the G7's China counter? Not at all clear. Follow the Indian press and see what's happening here, because India is likely to overtake China as the largest world power in terms of population in the next decade. China is already the largest world economy, or largest economy in the world, but it's not numerically going to be the largest in population for much longer because India's population rate is increasing faster than China. In fact, China's has started to decline to such an extent that they've now reversed a two-child policy and encouraged a three-child policy to continue the expansion of their own population. One of the big questions will be China's next tech boom. They claim to have made a lot of progress in agriculture, and this is one area that'll be very crucial to watch if it's extended to Africa through the new kind of initiatives that they're taking on with the Belt and Road Initiative. Will there be an impact on African agriculture, or will it be a process of extraction as the railroads and port structures have been in the past in other scrambles for Africa? We should take a look and keep an eye on what's next, because Africa, as well as the rest of the world, needs now to develop new strategies for survival and solar survival on a solar-powered agriculture.